What happens when the most powerful woman in an empire was once its most scandalous? The wind still echoes through the broken archways of Constantinople. Dust clings to forgotten mosaics, and somewhere beneath the gold and marble, a story waits, sharp, silent, and unfinished. She began as a dancer, clothed in feathers and firelight. They called her unclean. They called her dangerous. And yet, within a few short years, she was Empress of Byzantium, rewriting laws, silencing enemies, and standing between a panicked emperor and the collapse of an empire. Who was Theodora? How did she rise from scandal to sovereignty? What secrets did she keep beneath her veil? In the ruins of old basilicas, in the margins of censored scrolls, and behind the cold mask of a mosaic that still watches us from Ravenna, her story flickers. She reformed a broken empire. She may have betrayed her allies. She saved lives. She destroyed reputations. And in her silence, she left behind clues no history book could contain. This is not just the story of an empress. This is the descent into a legacy of fire and stone. And you are the one walking into it. Step carefully. The past does not forget. And Theodora is still waiting. The dust still clung to my boots as I stepped into the forgotten bones of the Hippodrome. The arena was silent now, its stones cracked, its shadows long, but I could almost hear the roar of the crowd rising like a tide, the thunder of hooves, the chant of rival factions. And somewhere beneath the torches, a girl stepped onto the stage. She was not royalty then. She was not even respectable. Theodora. A name now etched into mosaics of gold. But back then, she was just a performer, the daughter of a bear keeper, born into the tumult of Constantinople's underworld. Her world was not carved in marble. It was stitched together in tents and backstage silence, in laughter that masked hunger, in costumes faded by sweat and firelight. She was a child of the Demes, the factions that ruled the Hippodrome with color and chaos. Her father died when she was young. The Blues refused to keep the family under their wing, so her mother, desperate, begged the Greens to let her daughters perform. That was Theodora's first stage. Not a throne room, a circus, a pit of jeers and coins tossed like insults. In those early years, the city knew her body before it knew her mind. Ancient chronicles, mostly written by her enemies, claimed she danced with scandal, that she acted in bawdy comedies, that her performances blurred the line between theater and provocation. They whispered about her peacock feathers, about a swan's egg she used on stage, about the roles she took and the ones she was forced into. But what those writers called disgrace might have been something else entirely, a weapon, a mask, a way to survive in a world that did not offer girls like her anything but the edge of a blade. Imagine standing before thousands of drunk spectators, all hungry for entertainment, knowing one wrong move could cost you your life or your livelihood. Yet she made them look, made them remember. In a city of emperors and patriarchs, she turned scandal into strength. The Hippodrome was not just her stage, it was her training ground. Every cheer, every insult, they forged her. They taught her how to read a crowd, how to disarm with charm, how to command silence, then laughter, then awe. Even in the vulgarity, there was calculation, a mind learning how power flowed and how to steal it. Yet no stage lasts forever. At some point, she vanished from the scene. Some say she was cast aside. Others say she left. But the silence in the record speaks louder than the words. Her trail fades into rumors. She disappears like a dancer exiting through smoke, until she reemerges, not as a performer but as a penitent, a seeker, a woman on a journey far from the lights of the Hippodrome. It was in an old cellar beneath the city that I found a shard of painted plaster, faint traces of gold leaf, a woman with outstretched arms, her face blurred by centuries, but her stance unmistakable, poised, defiant. Theodora may have left the theater, but the stage never left her. She carried it with her, into exile, into faith, into the halls of power that would one day quake at her presence. But that is where we follow her next, to Alexandria, where the torchlight gave way to candle flame, and a different kind of fire began to burn. The ship must have rocked like a cradle over a storm-tossed sea. Aboard it, Theodora stood alone. No attendants, no riches, just the silence of departure. She was leaving Constantinople, not in triumph, but in transformation. The city had spat her out like a stone from its mouth. But exile does not always mean defeat. Sometimes it means rebirth. The path took her south, to Egypt, to Alexandria, a city older than empires, where marble cracked under desert heat, where Greek philosophy still whispered through narrow alleys, and where the sacred and the forbidden lived side by side. Theodora's arrival was not recorded with fanfare. There are no official documents, no parades. But in the folds of old letters, the ones tucked into monastery walls and sealed beneath wax, her name appears again, softer now, like a prayer. It was in Alexandria that something shifted. Here, she stepped off the stage and into the shadows of thought. She found the Monophysites, the sect exiled from orthodoxy. Their belief was simple yet dangerous, that Christ had one divine nature, not two. It was a theological fracture that tore the empire in half, and Theodora, the outcast, found shelter among the outcasts. In the candle-lit cells of Coptic monasteries, she listened, not as an empress but as a student. Imagine her there, wrapped in linen robes, far from the silks of her past, surrounded by men who had buried themselves in sand and silence. And yet, she stood among them, absorbing their resilience, their fire, their defiance wrapped in devotion. Perhaps it was the first time she felt seen without judgment, not as a spectacle, not as a rumor, but as a soul in search of something lasting. We traced her journey through fragments, a monk's diary in Syriac, a scroll found behind a fresco of St. Catherine, a worn statue of a woman whose eyes look west toward Byzantium. Each clue pulled us deeper into the desert, into a silence that hummed with ancient breath. Alexandria taught her more than belief. It taught her survival on different terms. It showed her the power of networks built in whispers, how to shield faith behind locked doors, how to protect the vulnerable with invisible hands. Lessons she would one day use not just to save lives, but to shape law. But even here, she did not linger forever. Something stirred in her, a calling perhaps, a memory of the city she had left behind, of the man she would soon meet, of the destiny she had not yet claimed. When she returned to Constantinople, it was not with fanfare, not yet. But she was no longer the same girl who danced in the dust. She was a woman carved by exile, shaped by belief, and armored in silence. The desert had not erased her past. It had burned away what no longer served her, and left behind a clarity sharp as obsidian. She came back not seeking the stage. She came back to stand beside a man who would soon change the empire, but he would not do it alone. And that moment, that meeting between Theodora and Justinian, is where our path now leads, to a courtyard, to a conversation, to the spark that lit an empire on fire. It was not in a throne room that they met, not in the echoing halls of the Senate, nor beneath the domes of imperial chapels. It was in a courtyard, shaded by cypress trees, dappled with light, hidden from history. The palace of Hormisdas stood on the edge of the Marmara Sea, its walls white with salt and age. And somewhere within its garden paths, Theodora met the man who would change everything. Justinian, nephew to the emperor, a man of laws and letters, calculating, tireless, raised in the provinces but obsessed with the capital. He had no royal blood, but ambition flowed through him like a current. He studied night after night by oil lamp, absorbing Roman codes and ancient texts, dreaming of uniting the empire beneath one vision. And then came Theodora. We know little of their first words. No poet recorded their meeting, but whatever passed between them, it endured. He saw her past and did not flinch. He saw her intelligence, her clarity, her fire, and he did not try to dim it. In a world where most men kept women in silence, Justinian listened. There is a letter, unsigned, buried in the archive of Ravenna, written in a hand that trembles at the edges. It speaks of a woman who sees the whole board, not just the game. A woman whose counsel was sharper than any general's sword. Some believe it came from Justinian himself. A love letter disguised as a memorandum. But theirs was not just love, it was partnership. And not the kind spoken of in romance. It was strategic, ideological. She brought something to him the Senate could not. The voice of the street. The instinct of the overlooked. The steel of someone who had survived the mob and knew how to turn its fury into loyalty. Still, there were barriers, legal ones. Imperial law forbade high-ranking men from marrying women of certain social backgrounds. Actresses, courtesans. Theodora was both. The rules were clear, but Justinian rewrote them. He convinced Emperor Justin, his uncle, to change the law. It was not an amendment whispered through loopholes. It was a direct strike against tradition, against the aristocracy, against the idea that one's birth should define their destiny. And so, Theodora, daughter of a bear trainer, became a patrician, and then his wife. Imagine the gasps in the palace corridors, the quiet rage of noblewomen, the trembling hands of senators pouring wine that night. This was not just a scandal, it was a declaration. She would not be a consort in name only. She would sit beside him in ceremony, speak beside him in council, shape the future with the same hands that once danced for coins. And he welcomed it. What they built together in those early days was more than affection. It was alignment. Two minds sharpened by fire locked onto the same horizon. But their union would soon be tested, not by court gossip or foreign threats, but by flames rising from the very heart of the city. For not long after their marriage, the empire itself would catch fire. The people would riot. The throne would shake. And it would be Theodora, not Justinian, who would decide whether the crown would survive. That moment waits for us in the next chapter. In smoke, in fury, in a choice made in the heart of terror. The ceremony was quiet, at least by imperial standards. No triumphal arches, no public procession. But the walls of the palace felt as if they leaned in, listening, watching. The whispers had already spread through every corridor of Constantinople. Justinian had married her, Theodora, the dancer, the courtesan, the woman the aristocracy had warned him about, and yet he had done it. The law had been changed for her. Not bent, not hidden beneath ritual, but rewritten in ink and proclamation. By imperial decree, she was no longer forbidden, she was elevated. What had once been a stage name was now the name of an empress. But not everyone bowed. In the dark corners of the Senate, noble voices spat her name like venom. The social order, carefully maintained for centuries, had cracked. If a woman like Theodora could wear the purple, what did that say about bloodlines? About tradition? About power? She did not answer their fury with words, she answered it with presence. Theodora did not fade into the background as so many imperial wives before her had done. She stepped into the public eye with poise and precision. Every appearance beside Justinian was a statement. Her silks were chosen with care, her posture sharpened like the edge of a blade. She wore the crown not as ornament, but as armor. Inside the palace, she was no ceremonial figurehead. She sat in meetings, she weighed in on matters of law, theology, diplomacy, and Justinian listened. Not out of obligation, but out of respect. To many, this was the most shocking part of all. An empress not content with embroidery or charity, but one who governed. A letter found in the ruins of a senator's estate, written in hurried Greek, speaks of the empress who rules the emperor. Whether that was praise or criticism depends on who you ask. But either way, the message was clear. She was not a shadow, she was a force. In the streets, the reaction was more divided. Among the poor, among women, among the forgotten, there was admiration. Theodora had climbed from nothing. Her presence on the throne whispered a dangerous thought, that perhaps fate could be defied, that perhaps the rules were not as sacred as they seemed. But in the palaces of old money, in the ranks of the elite, there was rage. Rumors spread like wildfire that she still practiced her old ways in secret, that she charmed the emperor with spells, that she undermined the church. The gossip, in its desperation, revealed more about the fear she inspired than any truth it claimed to hold, yet she remained unmoved. Every appearance, every law passed, every silence held in the face of scandal was a kind of power, and, though her past never vanished, she never let it be used as a weapon against her again. Still, the true test of their union had not yet come, for the empire was a powder keg. The factions in the Hippodrome, the same ones that had once decided her fate as a child, were rising again, this time not to cheer a race, but to burn the city. What happened next would define her legacy forever, not as a wife, not as a woman, but as a ruler. And when the fires came, when the mob stormed the palace gates, it was not Justinian who held the line, it was Theodora. And in the next breath of our journey, the city will burn, and she will choose to stay. The city burned for 5 days. Smoke curled above the domes like mourning veils. The streets were chaos, filled with ash, blood, and broken marble. And at the heart of it all, the Hippodrome once again became a crucible, not of sport, not of ceremony, but of rebellion. They called it the Nika Riots. But it was more than a riot. It was a civil war ignited in the capital itself, sparked by rival chariot factions, the Blues and the Greens, whose loyalty had turned volatile. The people were angry at taxes, at corruption, at the brutality of imperial officials. What began as chants in the Hippodrome soon became a roar across the city. Temples were ransacked, homes set ablaze, statues toppled, and then they turned toward the palace. Justinian was paralyzed. The empire he had worked so tirelessly to reform was crumbling beneath his feet. His advisors urged retreat. There were ships ready at the harbor. If they sailed now, he could live to fight another day. Theodora sat beside him. The court waited for her answer. And when she spoke, history turned on its axis. According to the chronicler Procopius, she said these words: "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. I will not flee. Purple makes a fine burial shroud." Silence fell over the court. She had drawn a line, not with a sword, but with her resolve. She would not run. She would not allow the mob to dictate the fate of the empire. And in that moment, Justinian made his decision. He stayed. What followed was swift, brutal, final. Justinian called upon his generals, Belisarius and Mundus. They entered the Hippodrome with swords drawn and banners high. They slaughtered thousands. Blood soaked the sands where Theodora had once danced as a girl. The same arena that had launched her into spectacle now served as a grave for dissent. The city wept, but the throne endured, and it endured because of her. Theodora's courage in that moment was not dramatic, it was strategic. She understood power not as glory, but as responsibility. She knew that if they fled, the empire would fracture. That fear spreads faster than flame, and that sometimes, to hold the future, you must stand still when everything else burns. In the ruins of a nearby chapel, we found a charred cross, half melted, fused to a tile. On the back, scratched by hand, were the words, "She did not run," no name, no date, just a memory. Even her critics could not deny it. Theodora had saved the empire, but the cost was immense. Over 30,000 lives lost in a single day. Rebellion buried beneath imperial marble. The city would be rebuilt, stronger, grander. The Hagia Sophia would rise from the ashes. But the wounds ran deep, and the crown, though it remained on their heads, grew heavier. Theodora emerged from the fire, not as a survivor, but as a sovereign. She had faced the unthinkable and chosen resolve over retreat. But even as the fires died down, a new kind of war began, one not fought with swords or crowds, but with ink, with whispers, with lies sealed in scrolls. And the man who would write them was already watching. We now enter the next shadow, the Shadow of Procopius. It was in a stone vault beneath a Venetian monastery that I found the manuscript, bound in flaking leather, its script etched in haste, its margins stained with wax and sweat. The title whispered like a warning, Anecdota, the secret history, and the name most often inked into its venom, Theodora. The author was Procopius, court historian, legal advisor, architect of imperial narrative. By day he wrote praises, grand chronicles of Justinian's triumphs. By night he wrote this, a hidden account, one he never published, one he may have never intended to be read in his lifetime, a confession, or perhaps a betrayal. In these pages, Theodora becomes monstrous. He paints her as lewd, cruel, insatiable. He writes not like a historian, but like a man possessed. He accuses her of depravity that stretches belief, of punishing rivals with surgical precision, of humiliating senators, of controlling Justinian with witchcraft and lust. The tone is bitter, the details lurid, the hatred unmistakable. But why? Was it resentment? Procopius, after all, came from the old guard, Men whose world had been upended by her rise? Or was it something deeper? The terror of watching a woman from the streets ascend to power and wield it without apology. For every allegation, there is a shadow of truth, twisted, stretched, framed to wound. Even modern scholars can't agree. Was Procopius exposing a secret tyranny, or was he crafting a dark mirror to justify his own disillusionment? We examine the manuscript under ultraviolet light, tiny corrections in the ink, whole passages added in a different hand, as if even he at times doubted himself, or feared the truth too much to leave it unguarded. And yet, some of what he wrote rings close to what other records suggest. Theodora was ruthless. She did exile rivals. She did silence critics. She did wield her role like a blade. But does that make her evil, or simply imperial? It is hard to say where history ends and vendetta begins. In one passage, Procopius describes Theodora summoning a group of senators only to laugh as they begged for mercy. But elsewhere, we find letters from those same officials praising her for her judgment, for her mediation, for her reforms. The contradiction is sharp, but perhaps that is the point. She defied simplicity. She could not be boxed into saint or villain. And for men like Procopius, that was the greatest sin of all. What lingers, though, is how much we owe to these very lies. The secret history, for all its bile, preserved parts of her story that official accounts buried. Without it, her early life might be dust, her fury, her defiance, her raw human power erased. In condemning her, he immortalized her. And so we walk a narrow path between distortion and memory, between defamation and revelation. And in the flickering light of this dangerous text, a more complex truth begins to emerge. Theodora was no puppet, no footnote. She shaped law, she moved armies, she molded faith. She did what few dared, and that made her dangerous. But as the ink of her enemies dried, Theodora was already looking elsewhere, toward the people no one saw, the lost, the trafficked, the voiceless. Because while Procopius sharpened his pen, Theodora turned hers toward reform. And that is where our path leads next, not to scandal, but to sanctuary. The parchment was thin as breath, fragile, torn at the edges. But the words were still clear, a decree, sealed with the imperial stamp, bearing Theodora's name, not Justinian's, hers. It was an order establishing a house of refuge for women, for the trafficked, for those cast aside by society's gaze. In that moment, I realized something often buried beneath the grandeur and scandal. Theodora was a reformer, and she wielded her past like a key. She had lived what others merely judged. She knew the cost of being visible in a world that punished women for existing outside the script. So she rewrote the script, not with fire or fury, but with law. One of her most striking reforms was the establishment of the House of Repentance, just outside the city walls. There, women who had been forced into prostitution, whether by poverty, coercion, or abuse, were given shelter, not punishment, not exile, safety. It was unheard of. In a society that saw such women as disposable, Theodora saw them as survivors, as sacred. She didn't stop there. She pushed through laws that banned trafficking and increased penalties for those who profited from human misery. She passed measures that gave women the right to own property, to inherit, to initiate divorce, to escape forced marriages. These were not symbolic gestures, they were structural, concrete, etched into the empire's legal spine, and they came at a price. Powerful men, especially those who profited from the old ways, bristled. In the margins of their letters you can still see the unease. The Empress overreaches. She shames the natural order. She invites chaos. but she did not waver. Theodora governed with clarity, not charity. She did not pity the weak. She empowered them, because she had been one of them. In one chamber of the old palace, long since buried, we found a faded fresco. It showed a line of women entering a great hall, some barefoot, some clutching infants. At the center stood a woman robed in purple, her hand extended, not in command, but in welcome. No name was painted, but we knew. She changed more than law, she changed perception. In sermons, in court records, in foreign embassies, the idea of what a woman could be was evolving, and behind it all stood Theodora. Yet, for all her public reforms, she kept part of herself hidden, her motivations, her memories. She never wrote memoirs, left no personal letters. What we know comes from policy and silence. But in that silence, we hear something profound. She was not seeking redemption. She was seeking justice. And justice for her was not theoretical. It had a face, a voice, a history. Still, her past never fully let go. Even as she elevated others, whispers followed her, that she did it for image, for control. But when you stand in the shadow of her laws, when you see the actual ink, the real signatures, the material lives changed, the whispers fade. Theodora was not performing, she was building, and while her enemies scribbled rumors, she wrote the future. But she was not done shaping the empire. There was another battle, one fought in secret. In hidden chapels, in whispered creeds, a war of faith, one she fought alone, against the church, and sometimes against her own husband. That war waits just beyond the veil, in the next chamber of her legacy. The chapel was barely larger than a stable, its stone walls weathered by centuries of silence. No gilded altar, no mosaic saints, just a crude cross etched into the plaster, and behind it, a niche once used to hide sacred texts. It was here, in the dust of an abandoned monastery in Syria, that her name appeared again, not as an empress, but as a protector, a saint. To the Monophysites, Theodora was more than a ruler. She was salvation cloaked in silk. While Justinian ruled beneath the banners of Chalcedonian orthodoxy, the official position of the empire, Theodora walked a parallel path. She had not abandoned the faith she found in exile. The doctrine of one divine nature in Christ remained her compass, and though it was condemned, she did not flinch. She used her rank to shield what the empire hunted. Theodora became a quiet sanctuary for exiled bishops and persecuted monks. She arranged safe houses across the eastern provinces, funded secret churches beneath vineyards and villas, smuggled priests in the guise of merchants and scribes, and all of it was done beneath the surface of official ceremony, a shadow network of faith hidden within the marble halls. In the archives of a Coptic monastery, we found records of letters sent by Theodora herself, gentle in tone, precise in instruction, offering protection, patronage, or safe passage. Each one signed not with imperial arrogance, but with spiritual urgency. It was a dangerous game. Her husband, Justinian, enforced orthodoxy with zeal. He closed heretical churches, exiled bishops, convened councils to crush dissent, and yet, under his own roof, Theodora harbored those very voices. Some say he turned a blind eye, that her influence ran so deep, even he could not restrain it. Others believe their court was divided, 2 thrones, 2 doctrines, 1 empire. She never preached from the pulpit, never declared open rebellion. Her resistance was quiet, strategic, a whisper in the right ear. a safe door left open, a life spared when the church demanded punishment, and for many, that was enough. In the far reaches of the empire, in deserts and mountain valleys, she was remembered not just as empress, but as intercessor, a woman who defied the machinery of empire to protect the soul of a people. To them, Theodora was not heresy, she was hope. The irony is sharp. The woman once condemned for her past became a guardian of faith. The outsider became the shield. And while bishops in Constantinople debated her motives, the faithful in exile lit candles in her name. But even as she extended her reach into the sacred, time was pressing forward. The empire moved with her, but not always beside her. Conflicts between doctrine and governance widened, and within the palace walls, tensions simmered. Theodora was aging. Her influence was vast. But power, even wielded wisely, breeds resentment. She had built a sanctuary for others, but where was hers? Not in the Senate, not in the church, perhaps not even in the arms of her husband. Theodora's faith, like her rule, was hers alone, and it carried a cost. Still, her legacy in the underground church endured long after her death. In places the empire forgot, her name is still whispered. Not in grandeur, but in gratitude. But we are not done walking her path, for while she was fighting for souls in secret, the empire was immortalizing her in stone, far from the capital, far from judgment, where her gaze would linger long after her voice had faded. Our next step lies in Ravenna, where gold and glass speak her memory. Ravenna was quiet when I arrived. The wind moved gently through the cypress trees, and the canals glistened beneath a low winter sun. But within the Basilica of San Vitale, silence becomes something else entirely, sacred, dense, as if the walls themselves remember every footstep. And there, above the altar, she waits, not in flesh, but in mosaic, Theodora. She stands to the right of the Savior, cloaked in imperial robes of deepest purple, edged in gold. A halo crowns her head. Her eyes, wide, unwavering, stare into eternity. In her hands, she holds a golden chalice, offering it to the divine. And behind her, attendants gather like constellations, still, serene, watching, but none shine like her. This image, this immortal tableau, is not decoration, it is declaration. Ravenna was not the capital, it was a gateway, a stronghold between east and west. And this mosaic, crafted not long before her death, sent a message across the empire. Theodora is here. Theodora endures. Every piece of glass reflects a choice. From the curvature of her veil to the placement of her feet, symbolism breathes through the scene. She is shown equal to Justinian, who appears on the opposite wall. He holds the paten, she the chalice. Two parts of one sacred act, a shared rite, a shared rule. And yet her panel holds something his does not. A curtain, drawn slightly aside, a glimpse of an inner sanctum, a passage unseen in his depiction. Scholars have long debated its meaning. Is it a metaphor for her spiritual insight, her access to realms hidden from her peers? Or is it simply what it appears to be, an invitation? Come closer, it says. Look deeper. The craftsmanship is exquisite. Gold tesserae catch the light and scatter it like memory. Her robe is adorned with pearls and jewels, not just for opulence, but for storytelling. Each gem placed to echo purity, wisdom, and sovereignty. Her crown sits high, flanked by a jeweled diadem, But it is not the crown that captures you. It is the eyes. They do not smile, they do not beg. They simply remain. I stood beneath her for hours, watching how the light changed across her face. Morning made her regal, afternoon made her solemn. By evening she seemed almost mournful, as if she knew what would come, as if she knew how fragile legacy truly is. Because this was her final portrait. No statue survives. No portrait from life. Only this. 1,000 fragments of glass fused into memory. But even in this perfection, questions linger. Why Ravenna? Why so far from Constantinople? Some say it was a political maneuver. Others, a spiritual gesture. A way to ensure her image stood where the empire's edges frayed. Or perhaps it was insurance. A monument placed beyond the reach of court politics and religious tides. Whatever the reason, it worked. For centuries, pilgrims and emperors alike stood in that same spot, looking up, wondering, judging, revering. And yet, as her eyes met mine, I did not feel judgment, I felt clarity. She had carved her story into law, into faith, into glass. But even mosaics crack, even saints are forgotten. And behind the shimmer, behind the grandeur, her battles continued. Because court life was not made of stone and gold. It was blood and rivalry. And the next chapter of her journey was not a chapel, but a battlefield of influence, within the very heart of the palace. The palace glittered with light, but the air inside was colder than marble. Behind each smile, a calculation. Behind each gift, a threat. Theodora had climbed higher than any woman before her, but at the summit of power, the winds turned cruel. She was not alone on that peak. Around her, rivals moved like shadows. Court life in Constantinople was not governed by laws. It was governed by proximity. Whoever stood nearest the emperor held the most sway, and Theodora, who sat beside him not as ornament but as co-ruler, became both beacon and blade. To her allies, she was the empire's conscience. To her enemies, she was the storm behind the throne. One of her fiercest opponents was Antonina, the wife of General Belisarius. On paper, they should have been allies. Both women wielded influence through strength, not birth. Both shaped the men who shaped history. And yet, tension simmered beneath their alliance. Letters unearthed from a monastic library near Trebizond hint at their complex bond. In one, a courtier describes a banquet where Theodora and Antonina exchanged veiled barbs masked as praise. Their rivalry wasn't open war, it was colder. Strategic, each aware of what the other could do with a whisper, a look, a single word. Theodora feared disloyalty above all. She had seen what the court could do to women it deemed inconvenient. She had been that woman. Now, in power, she trusted few. Those who crossed her, or who merely seemed to, often vanished from public life. A noblewoman once accused of mocking the empress's past was suddenly married off to a provincial governor in a distant desert outpost. A general, rumored to have questioned her authority, was stripped of his command within a fortnight. These were not random events. They were messages. But Theodora's rivals were not limited to the court. Some lived within her own walls. Even Justinian's family grumbled about her growing influence. Nephews, nieces, distant cousins, all clinging to fading titles, all watching as Theodora rewrote the rules of hierarchy. One scroll, found in a private archive in Thessaloniki, details a plot to undermine her authority by spreading forged decrees in her name. The attempt failed, but the message was clear. Not all war is waged with swords. Some battles are fought with ink and rumor. Yet, she endured. Because Theodora did not react with panic, she moved with precision. When threats rose, she answered not with chaos, but with structure. Her influence over the court was not just fear, it was strategy. She placed loyalists in key roles. She cultivated informants. She turned the Byzantine court into a living organism, one where every breath flowed through her. But power, once held, must be fed, and that required sacrifice. Friendships were fractured, alliances tested. Even her marriage to Justinian, while steady in appearance, bore the strain. He ruled the army, the law, the church, but she ruled the room, and sometimes the two realms collided. Still, Theodora never relinquished her position. In an empire where emperors could be overthrown by mobs or poisoned by kin, she stood unshaken, not because she was feared, but because she understood the architecture of power, how to build it, how to bend it, and when to burn it down. Yet no amount of planning can stop what waits for all. In the stillness that comes after intrigue and ambition, illness crept in. And when the plague arrived in the capital, it did not care for titles. It entered palaces and slums alike. And it would test not only the strength of the empire, but the endurance of its empress. The city stank of rot and silence. Where there had once been the roar of markets and the clang of church bells, there was only coughing and the sound of wheels bearing away the dead. The Justinianic plague had come like a shadow with no edge, rolling in from the harbors, carried by ships, by rats, by the invisible breath of commerce, and it did not discriminate. Theodora stood at the heart of an empire unraveling. 1 in 3 souls in Constantinople would perish, entire neighborhoods emptied in days. Priests fell beside beggars, senators beside stonemasons, and within the palace, the black breath of death crept under every doorframe. Justinian himself was struck. He burned with fever, drifted in and out of delirium. For days he hovered near death, his skin pale, his body too weak to stand. The physicians gathered in hushed panic, poring over scrolls, mixing potions with trembling hands. But Theodora did not tremble. She governed. While the emperor lay near the threshold of the underworld, it was Theodora who held the threads together. She sat in council, issued orders, coordinated relief efforts through the wreckage of the capital. Eyewitnesses recorded her presence not as ceremonial, but absolute. One monk, writing in the margins of a death register, noted, "She did not flee the sick. She walked among them." That decision carried weight and danger. No one would have blamed her for retreating, to isolate, to guard her life. But she chose presence, not out of recklessness, but resolve. She understood the moment the collapse of an empire does not begin with the fall of walls, but with the fall of will. And so she stood, while the city buried its people in mass graves. Even those who hated her remembered her steadiness. Procopius himself, in his official histories, describes her composure during the plague with reluctant admiration. No scandal, no retreat, no abandonment of post, just relentless command. But the weight of the dead was immense. One street we walked through, just north of the old harbor, held nothing but silence now. Beneath it, layers of lime and bone, and in one sealed crypt, recently unearthed, archaeologists found a single ring, imperial, with the faint outline of a lion and the Greek word for watcher. It may have belonged to a court servant or a guard, someone who died following her orders. Someone who stood because she did. When Justinian finally recovered, the city was not the same, neither was she. Theodora had seen too much. Loss had etched deeper lines into her face. The palace, though still intact, echoed with ghosts. She returned to governance, but her eyes carried a new shadow, not fear, but grief. She had survived the flames of rebellion, the poisons of court rivalry. Now she had stared death in the face, not once, but thousands of times, and still she remained. But even power has its limits, and in the quiet after plague, a different sorrow took root. One not carved by politics, but by something far more personal. Not even an empress could escape the ache of loss, for somewhere beyond the records, she had a daughter, a child whose life flickers only in whispers. And in the next chapter, we descend into that silence, into the ache behind the crown. The records do not say her name. No court scribe etched it into stone. No official scroll marked her birth. But the rumors survive, soft as ash. That Theodora had a daughter, not with Justinian, but from the life she lived before the crown. The clues are few, scattered like broken pottery across forgotten places. A passage in the secret history hints at it, almost mockingly. A footnote in a bishop's letter refers to the child left behind. And in the depths of the city, beneath the layers of empire, we found something stranger still. It was a crypt, small, hidden in the foundations of what was once a chapel near the old cisterns. No name, no grand monument, just a marble lid, weathered smooth, and a faint carving of a lamb. At its base, an inscription, faded, almost gone. It read, "She who was loved in silence." It might have meant anything, but the burial style, private, protected, unclaimed by church or state, felt out of place for a time obsessed with legacy and display. Someone had wanted this resting place hidden and safe. The story, if true, was one Theodora never spoke aloud. She who moved empires, she who faced mobs and priests and monarchs, she never once gave voice to this loss. And yet, silence can speak louder than words. The idea of Theodora as mother is difficult to place. History has immortalized her as strategist, reformer, empress, not nurturer, but perhaps that was her choice. Not a rejection of love, but a defense of it. In a world that weaponized vulnerability, perhaps she learned to protect what she could not save. Some sources claim the child died young, illness perhaps, or hunger. In those years when Theodora wandered, from the Hippodrome to Alexandria, she had nothing. Survival was a daily negotiation, and the city was unkind to women, and crueler still to their children. If the girl had lived, she would have been erased anyway. Imperial bloodlines did not welcome ghosts from before the crown. Justinian never acknowledged her, and Theodora, once she took her place at his side, never named her. But in the soft folds of her legacy there are signs. The protection she gave to women, the shelters she built, the laws she crafted with careful hands, they speak of someone who knew the ache of abandonment, who knew what it meant to lose and to live with that loss in silence. There is one painting, unsigned, hidden in the lower levels of the Hagia Sophia, depicting a woman seated in mourning, a small figure resting at her side. Scholars say it is allegorical, a symbol of empire weeping, but the face, the shape of the eyes, mirrors the mosaics in Ravenna. It might be her, or a memory of her, a quiet echo left in stone. Whether the child was real or myth, Theodora's grief feels undeniable. not just in her face, but in her choices, her laws, her silence. That grief was folded into her crown, pressed between pages of reform and ritual. In the end, Theodora was not just shaped by ambition, she was shaped by loss, and it made her sharper, kinder, fiercer. But the years were catching her. The gold of her reign had begun to dull, and somewhere in the hush between chambers, her body began to fail. Not in the chaos of plague, not in the violence of rebellion, but quietly as the girl she may have once held. And so we come to the end of her path, to her final hours, behind curtains, beneath silence, still crowned, still watching. The final days of Theodora did not arrive with thunder. There were no riots, no divine omen split the sky. Instead, the empire moved as it always had. Processions, petitions, psalms, while behind thick curtains, the woman who had once defied it all began to fade. She died quietly, as if slipping between the pages of a history she had rewritten. The exact cause remains unknown. Some say it was cancer. Others suggest an illness cloaked in shame, whispered only in back corridors and apothecary ledgers. The physicians of the court, bound by secrecy and fear, left no clear account. What we do know is that her decline was slow, deliberate, managed. She withdrew from public life gradually. Fewer appearances in the basilicas, fewer decrees bearing her seal. But even as her body failed, her mind did not. She continued to receive ministers, to send directives, to guide, even from bed. One servant's journal, found locked in a chest in the ruins of the palace, describes the atmosphere in her chamber. There was no weeping, only listening. She spoke rarely, but when she did, all leaned close as though gathering her final commandments. There was no funeral parade through the streets, no imperial tomb lined with mourners. Her burial was private, unannounced. Some say Justinian feared unrest. Others believe it was her wish to pass not as a monument, but as a memory. Her sarcophagus was placed in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the imperial mausoleum, but no inscription marks her tomb. No epitaph boasts her triumphs. Only the shape of the stone tells you someone important sleeps within. And yet, her presence lingers. In the halls she once walked, in the laws still found in dusty volumes of Byzantine code, in the sheltering houses tucked into the folds of old neighborhoods, in the mosaic that glows in Ravenna. Theodora did not fade with death. She diffused. For Justinian, her absence left a void. His rule continued, vast, ambitious, relentless, but something in his tone changed. His decrees became colder, more distant, as though the flame that once warmed the empire had been extinguished. In one letter, addressed to a bishop and sealed with his personal ring, Justinian writes, "She understood what I could not. That strength and compassion are not opposites, but twins." It is one of the few lines he ever wrote that feels like grief. We stood in her final chamber once, or what remains of it. The walls were cracked, the floor damp with centuries. But in the silence, it was easy to imagine her there, surrounded by tapestries, holding a prayer scroll, watching the light fade across the marble. No more speeches, no more whispers, only stillness. But Theodora was never just a voice of her time. She was its architect. And though the empire moved on, the shape she carved into it never fully vanished. Still, her story does not end at her tomb. Because long after death, she began to rise again, not in flesh, but in memory. In the churches that still invoke her name, in the codes of law that still echo her hand, and in the quiet spaces where legacy waits. But as we step away from her resting place, we turn to what remains, not only what she did, but what she left behind, a legacy written in faith and law, in survival and vision. And that we follow next. Time has a way of softening edges, polishing even the fiercest lives into faint outlines. But Theodora's legacy has not faded. It has settled into law, into ritual, into the unseen architecture of culture. She is no longer just remembered, she is embedded. Long after her death, imperial decrees continued to bear her influence. The laws she helped shape remained untouched for generations. Laws that protected women from forced prostitution, that gave them the right to own and inherit property, that allowed widows to keep their children and their dignity. These were not symbolic gestures. They redefined how an empire saw its most vulnerable. In legal archives buried beneath layers of later amendments, we found her name cited in footnotes, scribbled in the margins of scrolls. One particular text, dated decades after her passing, begins with a phrase seldom granted to an empress. It reads, "As written by the wisdom of Theodora." Her voice did not vanish, it echoed, and in faith she remained more than memory. To the Monophysite Christians, especially those in Syria, Egypt, and Armenia, she became almost mythical, a defender of the true nature of Christ, a holy protector of the persecuted. In their churches, small icons depict her not in royal splendor, but as a humble figure, veiled in white, offering sanctuary to a bishop or a child. We entered one of those churches, hidden in the hills of western Syria. The floor was cracked, the ceiling blackened by candle soot, but in the corner stood a single fresco, still intact, Theodora haloed, offering bread to a kneeling figure. No name, no explanation, just presence. It wasn't Rome that canonized her, nor Constantinople. But in the silence of the forgotten, sainthood clung to her anyway. Her example outlived the institutions that tried to bury her memory. She had been many things: actress, exile, empress, advocate, and in each form she left behind something that endured. Women in later centuries invoked her name when entering court. Reformers cited her when pushing for change. Artists, both in the East and the West, used her likeness as a symbol of spiritual authority, the fusion of beauty, intellect, and unwavering will. And still, her reputation remained contested. Some modern scholars frame her as a political genius. Others accuse her of cruelty, of manipulation. And in truth, she was likely both, because history does not grant its legends the luxury of simplicity. But perhaps her greatest legacy is this: she changed what was possible. For a woman, for a survivor, for anyone whose past had been used against them. She broke the line between shame and sovereignty, between faith and force, between silence and command. And now, centuries later, we still walk in the world she shaped. In courtrooms, in churches, in every debate about who gets to rise and why. Yet, despite all this, the laws, the prayers, the art, her story remains incomplete. A mosaic always missing one final piece. Because she did not leave behind heirs to carry her memory. She left no personal writings, no final testimony, only silence. And a mirror that asks each generation what power means, what it costs, what it can create when wielded without apology. But before we leave her behind entirely, there is one more place to visit. One final fragment, half forgotten, hidden in the stone, waiting, not for answers, but for understanding. The passage was narrow, the air still, the torchlight flickering against damp stone. Beneath layers of collapsed walls and forgotten prayer halls, we found it the chamber untouched by centuries of empire and erosion. No grand entrance, no inscription above the arch, just stone. Cold, quiet. And in that stillness, a mirror. Not of glass or silver, but of polished obsidian set into the wall like an eye. Framed in faded carvings, half worn by time, it reflected nothing clearly, only shadows, only outlines. But beside it, etched into the stone in worn Greek, were 5 simple words. She saw herself and stayed. We don't know who left it. A servant? A monk? A daughter of one of the women she once sheltered? But whoever carved those words, they understood something few did. That Theodora, for all her power and posture, never ran from what she had been. She did not erase her past, she absorbed it and carried it forward into the palace, into law, into legend. This chamber may not have been hers, but it felt like her. Unadorned, defiant, still watching, she saw herself and stayed. There are few legacies greater than that. The story of Theodora is not just one of ascension, it is a story of return. Of facing the reflection no empire wanted to see, a woman born in the dirt who reached into the stars. A woman shamed who chose to wear that shame like armor. A woman silenced who rewrote the laws that once muzzled her voice. The mirror in the stone was not for her, it was for us, because in her story we see something ancient and still alive. That power is not granted, it is taken, forged, burned into being by those who refuse to disappear. And in every generation, we ask the same question: what will we do with what we've inherited? Theodora's hands never touch us, her voice never speaks to us. But her choices, they echo through courts, through councils, through the stories we tell about who belongs on a throne and who doesn't. And if we listen closely, beneath the layers of history and legend, we can still hear her, not in sermons, not in statues, but in stone, waiting, another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I've learned one thing on this path. History doesn't whisper, it waits. The dust on my boots feels different now, not just from the streets of Constantinople, or the ruins beneath Ravenna, or the forgotten chapels of Syria, but from the weight of walking with her, from tracing the life of a woman who should have vanished and didn't. Theodora was never supposed to be remembered. History was written by the scribes who hated her, and yet she remains, not in clarity, but in complexity. She is part mosaic, part myth, part memory. And in that tangle, there is something deeply human, something enduring. She was flawed, brilliant, sharp, compassionate, and cold. She built laws with one hand and silenced enemies with the other. She knew what it meant to suffer and what it meant to rule. She crossed boundaries that were never meant to bend, and she did it without apology. Her story isn't clean. It's not meant to be, but that's why it stays with us, because we too live in a world that judges quickly, that forgets easily, that draws lines between worthy and unworthy, and calls them law. And in Theodora's life, we see the fracture in that illusion. We see the possibility of becoming something more than what we were told we could be. She turned shame into sovereignty, silence into structure, loss into law. And in doing so, She left behind not just a legacy, but a question. If power has always looked one way, who told us it had to? In the quiet corners of archives, in the cracked mosaics, in the words left unsaid, she waits. Not for glory, not even for justice, but to be understood. We move on now, deeper into the forgotten chapters of the world. Another vault, another name swallowed by time, but something follows us. Her presence, her defiance, her mirror in the stone, because history doesn't whisper, it waits. And we, the explorers of the erased epochs, we keep listening.